Greetings, friends. My name's Eli Sachs. I'm the director of the Jewish Publication Society, and I'm here today with Dr. Lawrence Kaplan, a professor of rabbinics and Jewish philosophy at McGill University, and the translator and also the author of the preface and introduction to the 40th anniversary edition of Halakhic Man. For those of you who haven't yet read it, Halakhic Man is the philosophical and theological masterpiece of Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik, one of the most important figures in Orthodox Judaism and really in Judaism more broadly in the 20th century. Halakhic Man originally appeared as a Hebrew essay in 1944, and Professor Kaplan served as the English translator for the first English edition, which came out with JPS in 1983 and won a National Jewish Book Award. He's now partnered with JPS to publish a 40th anniversary edition, which includes both the original text and a wide range of rich new materials. Professor Kaplan, thank you for taking the time to speak and think together today.
Thanks very much. It's really a pleasure to be here talking with you.
Well, the feeling is mutual. So if we look inside this new 40th anniversary edition, we read, and I'm going to quote here, that this is the classic work of modern Jewish and religious thought by the 20th century's preeminent Orthodox Jewish theologian and Talmudic scholar, Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik. Can you introduce us to Rav Soloveitchik? Who was he, and why is he such an important figure in Orthodox Judaism and in the history of Jewish thought and religious thought more broadly?
Yes. So let me begin maybe with almost some institutional facts, as it were, and then move to a broader lens. So Rabbi Soloveitchik, for 40 years, was the principal Rosh Yeshiva, the seniors or Talmudic teacher at the rabbinical school at Yeshiva University, and in that capacity, he ordained over 2,000 students. Also, for many of those years, he taught courses in Jewish philosophy at Yeshiva University's Bernard Revel Graduate School for Jewish Studies. In addition to his being the leading figure in Yeshiva University's rabbinical school, in general, he was the recognized leader of the modern Orthodox Jewish community. Thus, he was the head of the Rabbinical Council of America. That's the rabbinical organization, more the modern Orthodox, of rabbis primarily associated with YU, of their halakhah, their law committee. He was also the honorary president of Mizrahi, the Religious Zionists of America. He also played a major role in the Union of Orthodox Jewish Congregations of America. So pretty much he was the undisputed spokesman and leader and guide for the modern Orthodox Jewish community. I would say probably in a large part of the second half of the 20th century, from about 1950 till he retired in 1985. So that's in terms of, as I said, the institutional facts. In terms of sort of the broader lens, in terms of his broader importance, so he really combined two unusual features. First, he was a Talmudic scholar, scholar of the Talmud of Jewish law of the very first rank. As a matter of fact, many knowledgeable observers, not all associated with modern Orthodoxy, by the way, acknowledged him as the foremost traditional Talmudic scholar of his day, and he was unrivaled as an expositor and lecturer on the Talmud, for the clarity, for the insight, for his brilliance. I just say not necessarily associated with modern Orthodox. It was sort of well known that students from the more traditional, more right-wing yeshiva worlds would sneak in to hear his lecture. Somehow was disapproved because he's somehow, so why are you too modern? But this, as I say, was somehow universally acknowledged. So this is one aspect. On the other hand, As I mentioned, he taught courses in Jewish philosophy. He had a PhD in general philosophy, not specifically Jewish philosophy, from the University of Berlin, the leading German university of its day. And he really had mastered the body of the Western scientific and philosophical tradition. And we could say that in his work and his teaching, to a large extent, he tries to bring these two together to show the philosophic relevance of Jewish law, to try to understand Jewish law in philosophic terms, and also sometimes to engage in a critique of philosophy from the standpoint of Jewish law. And if you think about it, there are very few people who had this dual capacity. Maimonides, of course, comes to mind. Maimonides, the author of the great code of Jewish law, the Mishnah Torah, and the great work of philosophy, the Guide of the Perplexed, and a few others. But in that sense, Rabbi Soloveitchik is really one of a few in the history of Jewish thought. And in the modern era, I can't really think of anyone who quite equals him. I'm not saying that his work is, I'm going to say, it's hard to say, but anyway, on the same rank or level or magnitude as that of Maimonides, but even to be able to speak of them in the same breath is already impressive.
That's a really helpful introduction to Rabbi Soloveitchik. So we have this sort of towering figure in 20th century Orthodox Jewish life, 20th century Jewish life. And then we have this text, Halakhic Man. What is Halakhic Man about? What is Rabbi Soloveitchik attempting to do in this book? And how does he go about doing it?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned already, in a certain sense, he's trying to bring halakhah, Jewish law, and philosophy together. So halakhah, as I said, it is Jewish law. And let me say one or two things about sort of halakhah, and then about Halakhic Man. So halakhah is Jewish law. And traditionally, Jewish law has been at the center of Judaism. You had the whole realm of Agadah, non-legal reflection. You have Bible study. You have Kabbalah, many other spheres. But at the heart of Judaism, at least traditionally, has been halakha, Jewish law, and sort of what complements it, type of Talmudism, the study of Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, of the codifiers, of the commentaries, all elaborating upon Jewish law. One could say, to a certain extent, that when Rabbi Soloveitchik wrote his essay, Halakhic Man, it was somewhat a low point in religious life in the United States. In general, Judaism was associated with ethnicity, somewhat with ceremonial, but in terms of serious study and practice of Jewish law, it was rather weak. And not only that, the whole figure of the traditional halakhic man, the person who studies and practices the law, had, as it were, fallen out of favor. The traditional yeshiva student, or the rabbi, was not looked upon with such great seriousness. Actually, it's very interesting. Just literally the other day or the other week, there's a short biography by Tova Lichtenstein, the daughter of Rabbi Soloveitchik, about her mother, Mrs. Soloveitchik. And basically, her mother's brothers, who was studying at the University of Berlin, knew Rabbi Soloveitchik from the University of Berlin. They wrote to her, she was studying at another university, that here there was this brilliant young student of philosophy. There was this brilliant young student of philosophy from a distinguished rabbinic family. Maybe they would like to meet, and the rest is history. But of course, the point is, they introduced him as a student of philosophy, not as a rabbinic scholar. And she actually writes that even among her peers who are traditional and other traditional families, the yeshiva student was looked as some type of insular figure, maybe caught in some type of backwater. So I think that sort of shows about the feelings of the time. So in the essay, he wants to have a portrait of Halakhic Man, of Halakhic Man, the individual who's committed to the study and practice of halakhah, of Jewish law, and to use philosophical categories to bring out his true stature, and as well his true relevance. And actually, at the very end of the essay, he engages in somewhat of an apologia, saying that this is only an indifferent piece of work. But the reason I'm writing it is to defend the honor of those who have criticized Halakhic Man and really failed to appreciate him. So, as I said, he does this first by using certain philosophical categories. It's rather interesting. It's Halakhic Man. Its sense is not so much on the law itself, although he obviously speaks about this, but the individual, and it's a particular individual, and also not so much on theology, although theology plays a role. He uses what's known as phenomenology. Phenomenology is a modern school of philosophy that focuses on the structures of consciousness, people's attitude to the world. So he really wants to understand what is the mode of consciousness of Halakhic Man. How does he approach the world? And he makes actual claim. Here you see the modern flavor that halakhah is it's not just practices, certain rites or rituals. It's sort of a mode of perceiving of realities, a type of lens whereby you view the world. He actually compares it to the philosophy of Kant. I mean, it's a little hard to give a summary of Kant on one leg in one sentence, but Kant's argument is, in order to perceive the world, we have to bring to it our own categories of understanding, which then shape our own perception. So he really says something similar, that Halakhic Man is a cognitive type. He wants to understand the world, and he uses the categories of Jewish law in order to understand the world. So that itself, is somehow striking. It makes Halakhic Man, in some sense, almost a modern, disworldly, almost quasi-scientific figure, at least interested in knowledge. But at the same time, and I think this is a sort of main move, Halakhic Man is a religious type. So his argument there is that, and maybe here he uses a type of theological argument, basing himself on the idea that the origin of the law is ultimately divine revelation. God's presence is found in halakhah. So on the one hand, he's focused on this world, but on the other hand, he hasn't abandoned God's presence. And moreover, when you actually actualize and bring halakhah into reality, you've brought God's presence in the world. So it's a type of monistic view, a holistic view. The focus is on knowledge and knowledge of the world, but at the same time, you found God's presence in the world by bringing the halakhah down into reality. Just one final point here. I'm is when he speaks about actualizing halakhah, he's speaking about actualizing the totality of all of Jewish law. But the focus is on the moral imperative. And he actually speaks about the ideal of justice and righteousness is the pillar of fire which lights the way before Halakhic man.
So thank you for that introduction to the text. Also, thank you for that, I think, really helpful one-sentence introduction to Kant, which, as you mentioned, is no mean feat. So, as you mentioned, this book originally appears in Hebrew as an essay in 1944. There's then the English translation, your English translation, in 1983. How has this book shaped Jewish thought, religious thought over the past 8 decades?
Well, as I said already, when it appeared to say what he's doing, the honor of halakhah, the position of halakhah and halakhic man in the United States, in North America in general, as you saw even in Europe, was rather low. I mean, I think obviously not just halakhic man. I think he succeeded in restoring halakhah, at least within traditional Judaism, to its essential place of discussion, and giving back to it its intellectual respectability. I think the essay itself, by the very fact that he was able to explicate the significance of halakhah and the person, halakhic man, person who embodies its ideals and, as I say, is committed to its study and practice in these type of intellectual categories, lent the respectability. And just to add, I mean, his own activity, and I spoke about that before, his own activity as a teacher of Talmud on the highest level, again, it just complemented that. At the same time, he had critics. So when it took a while for the written discussion of the book to appear, and I speak about that in my preface, which is a sort of a history of its reception. But from the very end, we have records of people talking about it. Later on, people speak about the initial reception. So Professor Abraham Joshua Heschel, the noted theologian, who together with Rabbi Soloveitchik, we could say that these are the two major leading figures of traditional Judaism in the middle of the 20th century. Professor Alan Brill has called Professor Heschel Agadic man, not as opposed to Halakhic man. And actually, Heschel, when Halakhic Man appeared, it gave a seminar, which unfortunately he never published in his lifetime. We had notes which were published by a student after his passing. So Heschel delivered a seminar actually criticizing Halakhic Man. He said it's a brilliant work, but first he criticized it for privileging halakhah over agada, and Soloveitchik, I assume, would reply to that. Well, that's the point. But more than it said, by doing so, he's reduced halakhah to a cold, logical affair. So this raised the whole issue about law and spirituality. Now, the truth is that Soloveitchik, this is an old criticism of rabbinic Judaism, that somehow rabbinic Judaism is a type of dry and cold thing, lacking inwardness, lacking spirituality. And he actually raises this question in the beginning of section 14 of Halakhic Man. He says, Halakhic Man, devoid of the splendor of the raging, tempestuous sacred religious experience? So that's the question, right? He wasn't aware of Heschel, but people before Heschel had made the same point, that Halakhic Man lacks a type of passionate religious experience. And he answers, no. Halakhic Man is worthy and fit to devote himself to a majestic religious experience. However, for him, such a powerful, exalted experience only follows upon cognition, not knowledge. Only occurs after he's acquired knowledge of the halakhah, the ideal halakhah, and then how it's reflected in the real world. So his point is, we have to sort of move from objective to subjective. You start with somehow knowledge, and then you rational knowledge, and then you only come to experience. It's interesting. I have this in a footnote. It's interesting that Rabbi Soloveitchik's son-in-law, Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein, himself a great Talmudic scholar, actually criticizes Rabbi Soloveitchik on this point and says this would be it would limit religious experience to an elite, to the elite of scholars. And Soloveitchik himself, over the course of time, was aware of that, and actually he emphasized more, not so much the knowledge of halakhah, although as leading to religious experience, although that was always a point. He always said that you can't compare the experience of a Seder night, of someone who studied the laws of the Seder beforehand, to someone who's just practicing it without understanding. But still, he focused more on certain, what I would call experiential commandments, like prayer, repentance, the rites of mourning, rejoicing on the holiday, where you begin with the outward practice, the actual acts of verbal prayer or verbal confession, but the fulfillment is really an inward. So there's a move between outward and inward. So that this became actually a central issue. But generally, I would say he really succeeded in raising the issue of the nature of halakhah, even those who disagree with him, as a central part of the discussion. The whole field of philosophy of halakhah developed, not just because of him, but I think largely, to a large extent, because of him. And again, even when he served as a source of criticism, it was always stimulating discussion.
So you just told this really powerful story about Halakhic Man in its own time, about the reception of the text after its publication. I want to bring us to the present. Why does Halakhic Man matter today? How does this book speak to our needs, our concerns, our questions in 2023?
Well, I would really continue my line of thought. If anything, this issue of law and spirituality is really more pressing, more on the table today than in previous times. We now have the whole rise of neo-Hasidism, of being a type of Hasidic spirituality without being a Hasid. It used to be the definition of a Hasid is you have a Rebbe. You have this, yes. And now you can be a Hasid without a Rebbe. It used to be only Martin Buber could be a Hasid without a Rebbe. But now you have this type of emphasis on spirituality and all Hasidic accoutrements to it, in broad sections of the Orthodox community, even in the modern Orthodox community, and there have been studies of this within YU, which traditionally was the bastion of Talmudic rabbinism. So I'm just thinking literally, right? Last week, Yishai Rebo. Right? Yishai Rebo was at the Madison Square Garden, I think, first, with 15,000 people there, mainly religious, some or brands religious, but some secular as well. In Israel, it's more of a balance in terms of as follows between religious and secular. And I'm in Montreal, so I couldn't attend, but I saw something on video. And he had 15, and particularly the end, he has a famous song, Avoda, sort of an adaptation of the sacrificial rite of the high priest on the Day of Atonement, and all the people joining in, 15,000 people are singing, Ashreya am shekachalo, Ashreya am shashem elokav. Happy is the people that thus is theirs. Happy is the people that God is their, the Lord is their God. And then they conclude with what they said in the temple, Baruch Shem Kavod Malchut Olam V'ed, blessed be the name of his glorious majesty forever. And they keep on repeating it. So this is really religious experience at its height. And the question I was asking myself, so what would Soloveitchik have said had he seen this? And the irony is that every year before the Day of Atonement, he would study the laws of Maimonides about the sacrificial order of the Day of Atonement. Well, many students always say, I know it cold. This is one thing I know cold. So I think if Soloveitchik were seeing this, he would say, this is very nice, but it can't substitute for the study. It can't substitute for the knowledge. So you really would have to have the balance. Maybe he would admit that there is evidence that, if we move from Halakhic Man with his rather strong intellectualism to his later essay, I'll talk about it a little bit, The Lonely Man of Faith, which is a more existential, more personal. Himself, he might have admit that there was need for more of a balance between the law and spirituality. But as I say, I have a feeling that nowadays he might say the emphasis has gone to the other side. We almost need Halakhic Man as a counterbalance. So this is a sort of never-ending search to find the right balance between the two.
So we have ourselves caught in this never-ending search. We have Halakhic Man as a kind of resource for thinking about that search.
Right.
So can you tell us a little bit more about then kind of what that means for this new 40th anniversary edition? Why did we need a 40th anniversary edition of this book? What does this new edition offer readers?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I was thinking about this. If you look, I don't know, at series like the Oxford World Classics, Penguin Classics. So when people reprint philosophical classics, David Hume's treatise on human nature, all philosophical class, they all have introductions, they all have annotations, they all have glossaries. Okay, you say that's the 18th century, but the truth is, even works of literature, when works of literature nowadays are reprinted, Jane Austen, right? The annotated Jane Austen, or works of Dickens, or you can go. They're probably almost like nowadays 3 different translations of Proust with annotations, and so it sort of occurred to me that we don't really have this when it comes to modern Jewish philosophy. Where do you have a work which has been a classic work, which has a full-fledged introduction, annotations, glossary? We're almost like behind. We're behind. We're behind it. And particularly with Halakhic Man, as I already indicated, is a work, given Soloveitchik's background, which is deeply steeped in the rabbinic tradition, and it's deeply steeped in the philosophic tradition. So it's a work which is not easily accessible to the reader. And I think the reader needs, and this is the main point of this edition, needs help and a type of scholarly apparatus to make it accessible. I wrote a long introduction tracking the argument of Halakhic Man, because the truth is that I believe there is an argument there, but Rabbi Soloveitchik did not spell it out explicitly, and I think it needs to be teased out, which, as I said, I've tried to do. And the truth is, and maybe I fell into this myself in some earlier things I wrote about Rabbi Soloveitchik. People oftentimes saw Halakhic Man as a brilliant series of individual insights, scintillating, stimulating insights, but not actually having a sort of systematic work, that argument. So I argue to the contrary, and have tried to show this. And then annotations, which I think are very important, spelling out the details of the argument, giving references, explaining terms, parallels, etc. And finally, and maybe this is the most important thing, a glossary. Actually, over the years, I think more people have asked me, if you ever have another edition of Halakhic Man, have a glossary. That's what I kept on hearing from people, because particularly in terms of philosophy, Rabbi Soloveitchik, as I said, has a very deep background in philosophy and used it, and he dropped philosophical terms all over the place without necessarily bothering to explain them. And I think there are many people who are interested in this work, who are interested in Jewish thought, who perhaps lack this philosophical background. So I believe a glossary of philosophical terms will prove helpful. So one of the things I'm interested in terms of reviews is how far I've succeeded in making the work accessible. But that was the goal.
Well, and I'll just underscore just how much work Professor Kaplan has put into making this accessible. If you just sort of pick up the book and look at its table of contents, you see the preface, you see the introduction that was mentioned, the glossary, the annotations. There is a new bibliography. There's a new guide to sources. There's really a tremendous amount here that tries to bridge maybe the potential gap between some readers and communities on the one hand and this text on the other. And I think that brings us to another dimension of accessibility, which is not just the kind of contentful and the conceptual, but the linguistic. Halakhic Man was originally written in Hebrew. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about what it was like translating Halakhic Man from Hebrew into English. How do you go about engaging a work like this and ensuring that it has the same power and depth in English that it had in its original?
Well, it was a hard job. It was a daunting job. Around YU, where I was studied in the 60s, people always say, Halakhic Man is really untranslatable. But it's obviously not untranslatable since I did it. But in principle, I don't believe the work is untranslatable. Maybe Joyce's Ulysses, and even that could be translated. But it's still, as I deeply rooted in both the halakhic, as I said before, and rabbinic tradition. Almost, you say, the reason why it calls for this supplementary apparatus to make it accessible is also part of the reason why it's so difficult. It was so difficult to translate. So the first thing is really, and a lot of times I see not all translators get this right, to make sure that you get it right, that you understand it, Um, just a simple sense of accuracy. Now, and since, as I said, it's deeply steeped in the rabbinic tradition and in the philosophic tradition with all types of references, explicit references and implicit references. So, I have some background in both of these traditions. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been translating it, but still required a lot of work, right? Not to go back to the sources to make sure I understood things properly, to check everything, and sometimes they're actually the Hebrew editor wasn't necessarily the best editor. There were various mistakes in the references, which caused various problems I had to solve, but I only was able to solve it, as I say, by going back to the sources. So this is the first thing. Then you ask, how do I capture the power, the elegance of the work? I don't think there's any real answer. You try to do the best you can. In my case, one thing I did was to steep myself again in reading Soloveitchik's works, his Hebrew works, his English words, to get a sense of the style, of the flow, of the cadence, and try to bring his voice across this barrier of translation. So this is always the issue, right? I mean, how do you balance the two? How do you balance the concern for fidelity, for accuracy, with the concern for elegance and literacy and readability? I try to do the best I can. The readers will have to be the judge. What I can say, sort of in my favor, as it were, if I could, is that over the years, people have said that the essay flows. So I think that's, at least in English, they feel that the essay flows. So I feel that's an accomplishment. But one thing, actually, just to add, in terms of accuracy, I do have a page of errata, right? So things you always slip by. Fortunately, at least in my view, they're not too many and not too serious.
Well, you just brought us to think about the question of flow within a text, and maybe I'll bring our conversation to a close by asking us how the reader might move not just within the text, but outside of the text. So if readers want to learn more about Rabbi Soloveitchik and his thought, what else should they be reading?
Well, just as a guide, there's an Oxford bibliography which has guides to general work. So there's an Oxford bibliography, a guide to the works of Soloveitchik. It's available online. Google around, you'll find it, by Alan Brill and Alex Ozer. And that's an annotated bibliography. So it's a guide both to Soloveitchik's primary works and to secondary works with brief descriptions of them. So if the reader wants a particular guide, but I don't want to speak of secondary works as a whole literature, but in terms of primary works, so I think the next thing to go to is his other very famous work, The Lonely Man of Faith. And so Halakhic Man, as I said, appeared in 1944. The Lonely Man of Faith appeared in 1965, so it's 20 years later. But on the other hand, in terms of North America, that means that The Lonely Man of Faith, which appeared in English, was available in English. Well, Halakhic Man only became available in English, 20 years later in 1983. So for a long time, the only major essay which was known to the English-speaking reader was The Lonely Man of Faith, which is written in a more existentialist tone. But it's interesting, I mentioned this in my preface, after my English translation of of Halakhic Man appeared a number of years after. I was at a conference at Harvard, and there was a graduate teaching assistant in the course of modern Jewish thought. And I forget her name, and what she told me was that in terms of the essay for Soloveitchik they chose was A Lonely Man of Faith. Now with my English translation, they chose Halakhic Man. And the point was that The Lonely Man of Faith was really more a type of universal religious experience in a very powerful and passionate way. But they preferred Halakhic Man precisely because it was more internal. It presented a uniquely Jewish type, but in universal philosophic categories, going back to the point. But The Lonely Man of Faith is a key essay. And the other text which I would suggest, and I see that Alan Brill and Alex Ozer seem to agree with me, is a posthumous work, which Soloveitchik actually never quite completed. It seems to be like basically a book, but like a penultimate draft. It needed one final revision, and this is a very bold work called The Emergence of Ethical Man. I would call it The Emergence of the Human Personality. Where on the one hand, it's almost a work in biblical interpretation. He goes over the whole biblical story, beginning with creation with Adam and Eve, speaking about Abraham, Moses, but he uses that to speak about the emergence of the human personality, which strikingly he places in a very natural setting, like you see really his interest in science in that work. The human being is a natural being, and then through the moral norm, the human being develops an ethical personality and more broadly a human personality. So that's a very bold essay. One reviewer called it Soloveitchik's bombshell. Maybe an exaggeration, but a very important work. So I would recommend those two books, The Lonely Man of Faith and The Emergence of Ethical Man, as start, and then you can go in a million directions.
Well, thank you for that. And of course, everyone should find copies of those works, and first find copies of this new 40th edition text. There is actually going to be a link for those of you viewing this video. In the comments below, you'll see a link to our website, jps.org, where you can get your copy. I want to thank you, Professor Kaplan, for speaking with me today, and really for all that you have done to make Rabbi Soloveitchik's work accessible to readers and communities across the globe. It is a tremendous honor for us at JPS to be the home for this classic work, and we are thrilled to see it in the hands of so many people for whom it will mean so much. So thank you for all of your work, and thank you for taking the time to think and speak together today.
Well, thank you. And again, I'd just like to thank JPS in general for their originally publishing the translation 1983, and for undertaking, it was my idea, but coming on board with this 40th anniversary edition, which involved a difficult and complex project, and as they always do, they carried it out with exemplary professional aplomb.
Well, we are tremendous honored to be a part of this this ongoing story, and we look forward to seeing this book out in the world. Thank you
very much. My pleasure.